In the summer of 1942, few Americans had ever heard the name Guadalcanal. It was a remote island in the Solomon chain, humid, mosquito-ridden, and draped in dense jungle that swallowed sound and swallowed men. Yet on military maps in Washington and Tokyo, that forgotten speck of land suddenly burned with strategic importance. Japan was constructing an airfield there, a runway that would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia and give Tokyo a springboard deeper into the South Pacific. For the United States, still reeling from early defeats, Guadalcanal presented something rare, an opportunity to strike first. The Pacific Fleet had barely recovered from Pearl Harbor, but intelligence reports made the danger unmistakable. If Japan completed the airfield, the Allies would lose the ability to reinforce Australia and the New Guinea front. President Roosevelt approved the operation quickly, almost desperately. America needed a victory, any victory, to show that the tide could indeed turn. For the Marines preparing to land, it felt like stepping into the unknown. Maps were crude guesses, weather predictions unreliable. Officers warned their men that the terrain would be unlike anything they had seen. Mountains soaked in rain, rivers choked with mud, insects thick as smoke. But they also told them something else. Guadalcanal would be America's first offensive of the war. It was time to stop retreating. On the morning of August 7th, 1942, the silence above the island shattered. American carrier aircraft roared overhead, strafing Japanese positions around the half-completed airfield. Offshore, cruisers and destroyers opened fire, sending shells screaming into the tree line. Landing craft churned toward the beach, their ramps rattling. Marines packed shoulder to shoulder with rifles clutched tight. Then came the moment of truth. The ramps dropped. The Marines splashed into shallow surf and moved ashore, bracing for machine gun fire, for artillery, for the deadly resistance they had been taught to expect. Instead, nothing. The Japanese construction crews had fled into the jungle at the first bombardment, leaving behind tools, supplies, and half-finished fortifications. Marines advanced cautiously, eyes scanning the foliage, waiting for the trap that never sprung. By noon, they reached the airfield, later to be renamed Henderson Field. The landing had been almost surreal in its ease, but seasoned officers warned the men not to be fooled. The Japanese were masters of night attacks, ambushes, and counterstrikes. They would return. Guadalcanal was theirs by occupation, and Japan would not yield it without a fight. Within days, the truth became clear. The landing had been the easy part. The jungle around Henderson Field was alive with shadows and movement. Small Japanese patrols probed the marine perimeter, testing defenses, gathering intelligence. At night, the air vibrated with eerie insect calls and the soft crunch of unseen footsteps. Marines slept lightly, fingers on triggers. Then came the first major counterattack. Under cover of darkness, Japanese troops launched a furious assault, charging through the trees with bayonets, grenades, and blood-chilling screams meant to shatter resolve. The Marines fought back with machine guns and mortars, firing into flashes of movement between the trees. When the sun rose, the perimeter still held, but the men understood now what kind of enemy they faced. Meanwhile, the air war intensified. American Cactus Air Force pilots, operating from the rough, muddy runway, intercepted wave after wave of Japanese bombers and fighters. Many of their aircraft were patched with canvas and tape, but every sortie mattered. Guadalcanal had become a battlefield where every branch of the military, infantry, air, and sea, was fighting for survival. If the fighting on land was brutal, the battles at sea were chaos incarnate. The waters around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound for a reason. Ship after ship slipped beneath the waves. The Japanese excelled at night engagements, using their powerful long-lance torpedoes and uncanny night-fighting skills to deadly effect. American sailors found themselves thrust into battles they were scarcely trained for. In inky darkness, destroyers clashed at point-blank range, exchanging broadsides so close that crews could see the flash of the enemy's guns lighting the silhouettes of their ships. Many vessels disappeared within minutes, hit by torpedoes that struck like sledgehammers below the waterline. For the Marines ashore, the distant thunder of night battles became a grim, familiar soundtrack. They knew that each blast might mean fewer supplies, fewer reinforcements, and fewer ships left afloat to protect them. The fate of Henderson Field depended as much on the Navy's survival as on their own courage. As weeks stretched into months, Guadalcanal became a test of endurance more than a clash of armies. Supplies were scarce. Japanese forces, cut off by the growing American naval presence, suffered terribly, surviving on handfuls of rice, soaked biscuits, and whatever they could forage from the unforgiving jungle. Malaria swept through their ranks, leaving soldiers feverish, delirious, and weakened. But the Marines were not spared suffering. They too fought hunger, fatigue, and disease. Mosquitoes delivered malaria and dengue with ruthless efficiency. Fresh food was a rarity. Rations often arrived moldy or half-rotted. Rain turned trenches into swamps, fouled weapons, and soaked uniforms until skin blistered and peeled. Nights were filled with the buzz of insects, the crackle of gunfire, and the ever-present dread of another Japanese assault. Yet through sickness, fear, and exhaustion, one thing held steady: determination. The Marines knew that Henderson Field was the key. If they held the airfield, they could survive. If they lost it, they would be pushed into the sea like the early dark days of the war. Guadalcanal became a grinding contest of willpower. An American resolve refused to break. By mid-September, the air war over Guadalcanal had become a relentless daily struggle. Every sunrise brought the same ritual: Marines running for cover, anti-aircraft crews leaping to their guns, and pilots sprinting toward patched-up Wildcats and Dauntlesses. The Cactus Air Force, a ragtag mix of Navy, Marine, and Army aviators, fought with battered planes and limited fuel, but they held one crucial advantage. Henderson Field put them right on the battlefield. Japan, determined to crush the American foothold, launched near-constant bombing raids from Rabaul and other bases in the northern Solomons. Waves of Betty bombers escorted by agile Zero fighters screamed over the island, dropping explosives that cratered the runways and shredded support tents. But American pilots met them head-on. They took off through smoke and chaos, sometimes lifting wheels from a runway still shaking from bomb impacts. The dogfights were vicious and fast. Zeros spiraled through the sky with lethal grace, while American pilots relied on tactics, teamwork, and sheer stubbornness to stay alive. Losses were heavy on both sides. Aircraft returned riddled with holes, leaking fuel, or missing entire control surfaces. Some limped in for belly landings, others simply never returned at all. But gradually, the balance shifted. Repairs improved. More planes arrived. Veteran Japanese pilots, worn down by months of combat, were replaced by less experienced aviators. The skies, once dominated by Japan, were becoming contested. And from contested, they would soon become something far greater. On land, the Japanese regrouped for a massive offensive. Their target was clear: the ridge south of Henderson Field, held by a thin line of Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Lewis "Chesty" Puller. The men dug foxholes along the narrow ridgeline, surrounded by jungle so thick it muffled their own voices. They knew a storm was coming. On the night of September 12th, darkness swallowed the island. Then, from the jungle, came the rising chant of Japanese soldiers preparing to attack. Moments later, they surged forward. Waves of infantry crashed into the Marine positions, screaming "Banzai" as they charged uphill. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, and unrelenting. Machine guns overheated, bayonets snapped, and grenades lit the jungle with deadly bursts of light. Puller called for reinforcements. Army troops from the 164th Infantry Regiment, newly arrived and untested in jungle warfare. They ran into position just in time, pouring rifle fire into the enemy's flanks. Hours stretched endlessly. The Japanese attacked again and again, bodies piling beneath the ridge as they tried to break the American line. When dawn finally arrived, the landscape was unrecognizable. Scorched earth, splintered trees, and the fallen lying in heaps. Against overwhelming odds, the Marines and Army soldiers had held. Bloody Ridge became a symbol of American tenacity, and for Japan, a bitter sign that Guadalcanal would not fall easily. Japan refused to give up. Determined to retake Guadalcanal, they sent powerful naval forces south, triggering some of the most furious sea battles of the entire war. In the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese cruisers tore through Allied defenses, sinking 4 Allied ships in a single night. The ocean glowed with burning oil as survivors clung to debris. It was one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the U.S. Navy. But the Americans learned. Radar improved. Tactics improved. And when the fleets clashed again off Santa Cruz, the fight was far more even. Aircraft from American carriers engaged Japanese forces in a massive swirling battle over the open sea. Ships disappeared into smoke, torpedoes streaked across the waves, and dive bombers plunged at impossible angles. Both sides suffered. America lost the carrier Hornet, but Japan paid a steep price in irreplaceable pilots. Each battle eroded Japan's strength a little more. The once unbeatable Japanese Navy was beginning to feel its first fractures. By late 1942, Guadalcanal had become a war of starvation. Japanese troops, cut off by American naval pressure, were reduced to eating roots, grass, and insects. Soldiers collapsed along jungle paths, too weak to carry rifles. Some died with empty rice bowls, clutched in their hands. Malaria swept through their ranks, turning fevered men into walking ghosts. American supplies were not abundant, but they arrived. Canned rations, medical kits, ammunition, and fuel kept the Marines going. Still, the jungle punished them too. Constant rain soaked equipment, uniforms rotted, skin infections spread. Morale swung wildly between exhaustion and stubborn defiance. Both sides faced nature as much as each other. The jungle seemed determined to consume everything, men, machines, and hope. But one army was collapsing. The other was learning how to endure. Desperate to turn the tide, Japan launched one last massive offensive. Operation Ka. Thousands of fresh troops were landed on the island, ordered to smash the American perimeter and retake Henderson Field at any cost. Their commanders promised victory. Their soldiers believed the Emperor watched. But by now, the Americans were dug in, reinforced, and supported by increasingly dominant air power. When Japan attacked the Matanikau River line and later the Gifu strongpoint, they met walls of machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and precise airstrikes. The jungle floor shook with explosions. The cries of wounded soldiers echoed through ravines. Japanese units fought bravely, but they were exhausted, starving, and outnumbered. American forces counterattacked, pushing them back ridge by ridge. As December turned to January, it became undeniable. Japan could no longer hold Guadalcanal. The empire that had advanced across the Pacific for months was finally losing ground. As 1943 began, the U.S. command finally had the strength needed to shift from defending Henderson Field to pushing the Japanese back across the island. Fresh Marine and Army regiments arrived, bringing much-needed manpower, artillery, and supplies. Their advance was slow, grueling, and fought inch by inch through jungle so thick it swallowed entire companies. The Japanese had fortified hills, ravines, and river crossings, turning every ridge into a fortress. American patrols cut their way through vines and thorns, climbing slippery slopes while snipers fired from hidden nests. Mortar rounds echoed across the canopy, and the smell of damp earth mixed with gun smoke became constant. The Japanese fought with tenacity, but they were shadows of the force that had landed months before, weak from hunger, ravaged by disease, and increasingly isolated. Still, they resisted fiercely. Night after night, they launched smaller attacks, probing, desperate thrusts that signaled their refusal to surrender. But each clash ended the same way, with the Americans holding their ground and the Japanese falling back. The momentum of the campaign had fully shifted. Guadalcanal was no longer a battlefield of uncertainty. It was becoming a battlefield of inevitability. The Japanese High Command, once confident that Guadalcanal would become a decisive victory, now faced a bitter truth. The island was lost. Supplies could no longer reach the starving garrison. Reinforcements were dying before they even arrived. And American dominance in the air and at sea made further offensives suicidal. In January 1943, Tokyo made a decision it had once considered unthinkable: evacuate Guadalcanal. The operation, codenamed K, was carried out with secrecy and precision. Under cover of darkness, fast destroyers slipped down the slot between the islands, dodging American patrols to extract surviving Japanese soldiers. Marines noticed the change only gradually. The jungle grew quieter. Attacks stopped. Patrols found abandoned camps, empty shelters, scattered weapons, footprints leading toward the coast. It was not surrender, it was escape. And it saved nearly 11,000 Japanese soldiers who otherwise would have died on the island. For the Americans, it was a quiet victory. No final charge, no dramatic last stand. Just the realization that the enemy had vanished into the night, leaving Guadalcanal behind. On February 9th, 1943, the campaign officially ended. American troops reached the western coast and discovered what remained of the Japanese presence, mostly abandoned gear, wrecked artillery, and shallow graves swallowed by the jungle. General Patch, commanding the 14th Corps, announced the island secured. After 6 months of unbroken violence, Guadalcanal was finally in American hands. For the Marines who had landed in August, the transformation was surreal. The airfield they had fought for was now fully operational. Defensive perimeters became staging points. Mess tents replaced foxholes. But the emotional weight of the victory was undeniable. They had survived starvation, jungle disease, naval defeats, and relentless assaults. They had endured some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War, and won. Guadalcanal became a symbol, not just of survival, but of America's ability to seize the initiative. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had stopped Japan's momentum dead in its tracks. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. The fall of Guadalcanal sent shockwaves through both militaries. In Tokyo, the loss triggered political upheaval, forced resignations, and bitter arguments between Army and Navy leaders. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that the war might not end in triumph. Strategic plans were rewritten, defensive lines reconsidered, and whispers of doubt spread through ranks that had once radiated confidence. For the United States, Guadalcanal became proof that the island-hopping strategy could work. The combination of naval strength, air superiority, and relentless ground pressure had forced Japan to yield. Planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor immediately looked toward the next targets: the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and beyond. The psychological impact was immense. Guadalcanal wasn't just America's first major victory. It was a signal. The Pacific War would no longer be defined by retreats, by losses, or by desperation. The tide was turning, one island at a time. In the final accounting, Guadalcanal was far more than a single battle. It was the moment when the Pacific War changed direction. Japan lost irreplaceable ships, aircraft, and elite soldiers. Its offensive momentum dissolved. The empire that had surged across half the ocean now found itself straining to defend what it had taken. For America, the victory lit a fire that would burn through the rest of the war. Guadalcanal proved that U.S. forces, Marines, sailors, soldiers, aviators, could endure the worst conditions imaginable and still prevail. It forged heroes, exposed weaknesses, and taught lessons that shaped every campaign that followed. And for the men who fought there, it left scars, physical, emotional, and unforgettable. The island's jungles still hold relics of the fighting: rusted helmets, buried shells, and the ghosts of battles that define the Pacific. But its legacy is clear. Guadalcanal was the first step on the long road to the Allied victory, and the first time the rising sun began to set.